Okay, so today I will be discussing the Iron Curtain speech by Winston Churchill. It was also the official name of this speech was Sinews of Peace. And so first we should get into some of the background information of this event. So at the end of World War II, Russia, Britain, and the U.S. came out as the powerhouses of the war, but the only difference between them was that one, Russia had conquered the eastern half of Europe in the process, and second, Russia was communist, not capitalist. And Harry Truman and Winston Churchill, leaders of the U.S. and Britain, both saw this as a problem because, at least when it came to Europe, the Western democracies believed in self determination. They wanted to see that doctrine applied in Eastern Europe, particularly in Poland, no less than in Western part of the continent. However, the Soviet Union was steadfast in that nothing was going to stand in the way of the prosperity and security of their nation, and this was a huge concern for them after World War One and World War Two, where they had been invaded by Germany both times, and they saw these buffer states to their west as essential to their security and prosperity, and so they were seen as a threat to the free world that could wipe out the rest of Europe in this moment of devastation after World War Two, and so. In the winter between 1945 and 46, Truman also said, "Unless Russia is faced with an iron fist and strong language, another war is in the making. I'm tired of babysitting the Soviets." And then in February the same year, Stalin said, quote, "Communism and capitalism are incompatible." So these are some of the things leading up to this speech, to show some of the tensions that have already started at this point between the two countries, and why it was seeming like to a lot of people that a war was inevitable. And one point that Churchill wanted to make was that a war wasn't necessarily inevitable, but if we could not rally together, then it was pretty imminent. So this is why Churchill came to Fulton, Missouri. Um, Churchill felt that the U.S. and Britain needed now more than ever to come together, quote, "if the peace and order of the world are to be preserved from chaos." So, now, the speech itself. On March 5th, 1946, Harry Truman introduced Winston Churchill at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri, as the former British Prime Minister gave possibly the most important speech of his life. The speech was essentially sounding the alarm. He spoke of how Europe was in shambles after the devastation of World War II, and it has left it defenseless to the expansionism of the Soviet Union. This was also on top of the horrible winter between 1945 and 46 in Europe, and everyone was going hungry. All these countries were in an economic crisis. And he spoke of how the U.S. and Britain alone, if they form this is essential, that if they form a, quote, "special relationship, can save Europe." He spoke of how he does not believe that another war is inevitable, but that without the proper stern action that taken by the U.S. and Britain, that another war would be imminent. So I've taken out some of the parts of the speech that I found to be pretty important, and it kind of compiles as a somewhat summary, and here that is. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe: Warsaw, Berlin, Prague, Vienna, Budapest, Belgrade, Bucharest, and Sofia. All these famous cities and the populations around them lie in what I must call the Soviet sphere, and all are subject in one form or another not only to Soviet influence but to a very high, in some cases, increasing measure of control from Moscow. This is certainly not the liberated Europe we fought to build up. We hold the power to save the future. Neither the sure prevention of war nor the continuous rise of world organization will be gained without what I have called the fraternal association of the English-speaking peoples. This means a special relationship between the British Commonwealth and Empire and the United States of America. I do not believe the Soviet Russia desires war. What they desire is the fruits of war and the indefinite expansion of their power and doctrines. What is needed is a settlement. What we have to consider here today, while time remains, is the permanent prevention of war, and the establishment of conditions of freedom and democracy as rapidly possible in all countries. Our difficulties and dangers will not be removed by closing our eyes to them. One by one, we were all sucked into the awful whirlpool. Surely, we must not let that happen again. And so, basically, what he's saying here is that he doesn't want war necessarily, but if they are to prevent war, because the tensions are already getting pretty high between the East and West, and Russia had already said at this point capitalism and communism are not compatible, and Russia has the potential to invade the rest of Europe. He's saying that if we don't settle this now, there is going to have to be a war. And so obviously this took on a huge reaction with Russia, and so now we can go into Russian reactions. So Soviet Russia obviously was quick to combat the speech and used their primary newspaper, the Pravda, to tell their people of the evils of the Western leaders. Their main target was Winston Churchill. They believed that the Iron Curtain speech was an act of war. They said that he overreached himself and that his speech was a failure. They also began to bash the former prime minister in general, as they said things like Churchill had never marched in stop with history. He had always lagged behind on the road of unfolding historical events and made every effort to stop or hamper the course of such events. They condemned him largely for the hypocrisy in his statements about expansionism and freedom. They said that his words poisoned with the hatred of, quote, true democracy. They said that he's trying to culminate the Soviet democracy, which is, quote, true democracy. And then, so a key part to all this is to understand that Russia saw controlling Poland as a matter of life and death. And they also went after the U.S. and Britain's hypocrisy and how they deal with countries they have liberated, and the means for bolstering their own country. So they also started to condemn capitalism more and say that the U.S. and Britain were merely afraid that their large corporations were going to lose profits due to the so-called, quote, Iron Curtain, and they blamed the Western democracies for the Iron Curtain. And by Iron Curtain, they're just talking about this line between the East and West and what was controlled by the Soviets and what was not. And this term had been used before in terms of like when we talk about just countries that isolate themselves in general, whether that's in economically or just any type of isolation. But this is the first time that it was like widely used as a term of the divide between the East and West, and specifically from the Soviets. So now, it's from all these reactions from the Soviets, it's safe to say that after the Iron Curtain speech, hatred for capitalism rose rapidly in the USSR, and tensions were rising quickly in the East. For many Russians, Churchill had just declared war. So now we can get into U.S. reactions. So the U.S. officials commended the speech in the name of calling out the need for a strict stance against Russia, but some U.S. officials were less enthusiastic because despite the clarification that there would be no official alliance, which this was very intentional by Churchill, that he called it a, quote, special relationship. In the letters to Truman before, he said, I know that I can't say that we are going to have a true alliance. I know the repercussions of this. I know it will not come out well, so I'm going to just say that we need to work together. And but many Americans were really mad that he used this term of special relationship and this idea of a special relationship because many Americans were worried that Britain's crumbling economy was really clear, and the U.S. didn't want to be used as mere pawns to save it. And so many Americans were also mad due to the fact that their loved ones had just returned from war, and there was already talk of another war within a year of the last war. So that's definitely very worrisome for Americans. So there was a lot on that as well. But in the end, the speech was seen as a success because everyone agreed that on the need for action against communism in Britain and America. Many saw the speech as a success because everyone became more and more aware of how Soviet Russia was a threat, and everyone started to treat this as serious as stopping the spread of fascism. And it was compared a lot to the rise of Hitler and Nazi Germany. And so they were being compared to Nazi Germany in their quest for European domination. Overall, I would say that the reactions in Britain and the United States were erratic, but overall were positive of the speech. After the speech, the American people really understood that there was serious danger at hand, and for this, the Western tensions rose rapidly as well after the speech. And I think this was the real foundations for the Cold War were finally set up after this speech.